Euphemisms. It's a whole new language. Euphemistic language turns up in many areas of American life in a variety of situations. Not all euphemisms are alike, but they have one thing in common. They obscure meaning rather than enhancing it. They shade the truth, but they exist for various reasons. Sometimes they simply replace a word that makes people uncomfortable. For instance, the terms white meat, dark meat, and drumstick came into use because in Victorian times people didn't like to mention certain body parts. No one at the dinner table really wanted to hear Uncle Herbert say, "Never mind the thighs, Margaret. Let me have one of those nice juicy breasts." It would have made them uncomfortable. And at the same time, for the same reason, belly became stomach. But even stomach sounded too intimate, so they began saying tummy. It's actually a bit sad. I first became aware of euphemisms when I was 9 years old. I was in the living room with my mother and my Aunt Lil when I mentioned that Lil had a mole on her face. My mother was quick to point out that Lil didn't have a mole, she had a beauty mark. That confused me because, looking at Lil, the beauty mark didn't seem to be working. And it confused me further because my Uncle John also had a brown thing on his face, and it was clearly not a beauty mark. And so on that day, I discovered that on some people, what appeared to be moles were actually beauty marks. And as it turned out, they were the same people whose laugh lines looked a lot like crow's feet. By the way, that whole beauty mark scam worked so well that some women routinely began using eyebrow pencils to apply fake beauty marks, a fake mole being something no self-respecting woman would ever think of giving herself. Somehow I can't imagine Elizabeth Taylor turning to Joan Crawford and saying, "Lend me your eyebrow pencil, Joni. I'm going to put a fake mole on my face." By the way, it was only a few years after the Aunt Lil incident that I took comfort in the fact that some people apparently thought my ugly pimples were nothing more than minor skin blemishes. Another role euphemisms play is to simply put a better face on things, to dress up existing phrases that sound too negative. Non-profit became not-for-profit, because non-profit sounded too much as though someone didn't know what they were doing. Not-for-profit makes it clear that there was never any intention of making a profit in the first place. But some words that are euphemized aren't even vaguely negative. They're just considered too ordinary. For that reason, many things that used to be free are now complimentary. Asking the hotel clerk if the newspapers are free makes you sound like a mooch. But are the newspapers complimentary? Allows you to retain some small bit of dignity. This is the reason some hotels offer their guests complimentary continental breakfasts, while others give their customers free donuts. If you're one who would enjoy a closer look at euphemisms, you'll find a number of sections in the book that will interest you. I broke the euphemisms into segments because they play such a large and varied role in American speech. And I call it the new language because it's certainly new to me. I know I didn't grow up with it. And that's my larger point, that it's gotten worse over time. There were probably a few early signs I noticed, but I knew the problem was getting serious when I began to hear ordinary people refer to ideas as concepts. And now, stiff upper lip, you know. Imagine two different commercial airliners taking long, fatal plunges directly into the ground from high altitudes. One is a British Airways plane filled with staid English diplomats and upper-class landed gentry. The other plane is Alitalia, filled with uneducated Sicilian, Greek, and Turkish peasants. As the two planes dive towards certain destruction, which one do you think will have the louder screaming and the more colorful praying, cursing, and blasphemy? You get one guess. Hint, it isn't the British plane. More euphemisms. There's no part of American life that hasn't been soiled by the new, softer, artificial language. It's everywhere. When you travel, you notice it in the hotel business, or, as they prefer to think of themselves now, the hospitality industry. And by the way, hotels are one more place where you'll run into job title inflation. There was a time in a hotel when you checked in with the desk clerk. Now he's the front desk agent. When he answers the phone, he becomes guest services. I guess it's only fair. Everyone else in the hotel has been upgraded. The bellhop has somehow become a luggage assistant, and he claims to work in luggage services. The maids have been upgraded several times over the years. Cleaning woman, maid, housekeeper, now they're room attendants. And on the subject of rooms, depending on where you're staying, room service is likely to be called in-room dining or private dining. One brochure I read called it your private dining experience. Pretentiousness. Never underestimate the role pretension plays when it comes to creating euphemistic language. Here's another example of it. At one hotel where I stayed, the restaurant was temporarily located on the lower level. I was told the reason was that they were undergoing restaurant enhancement. Okay? The concierge actually uttered that phrase. Not remodeling, restaurant enhancement. And he said it as if it was something people say all the time. By the way, I shouldn't have to remind you that that lower level he referred to was once called the basement. I guess I don't really mind the phrase lower level, at least it's descriptive, although it is the comparative form and not an absolute. Lower than what? It also bothers me when they tell me the gym is located on level 3. Level 3 is just plain old pretentiousness. And I wish the hotels would make up their minds on what to call the gym. It's been everything. Gym, fitness center, exercise room, health club, spa. God. Spa! Used to be you had to go to Europe to find a spa. Now any place that has a sink and more than 3 towels is a fucking spa. And one more thing about hotels. A lot of them have replaced the do not disturb signs with signs that say privacy, please. Seems like a small thing, but there's a difference here that's worth noting. Do not disturb is assertive. It's strong. Do not disturb. It means go away. But privacy, please, is weak. It sounds as if you're pleading with people. Privacy, please? Softness. To my mind, it's one more example of the feminization of language that has taken place in this country. And more important, it represents a retreat from reality. Here's another example of the same problem. Thank you for not smoking. Now, speaking strictly for myself, I find nothing wrong with the phrase, no smoking. It's simple, it's direct, it's firm. No smoking. Any questions? Fine. But thank you for not smoking. First of all, it's weak. And second, for God's sakes, why are you thanking them? It's as if you think they're doing you a favor by not giving you emphysema. Personally, if I were trying to discourage people from smoking, my sign would be a little different. In fact, I might even go too far in the opposite direction. My sign would say something like, smoke if you wish, but if you do, be prepared for the following series of events. First, we will confiscate your cigarette and extinguish it somewhere on the surface of your skin. We will then run your nicotine-stained fingers through a paper shredder and throw them into the street, where wild dogs will swallow and then regurgitate them into the sewers so that infected rats can further soil them before they're flushed out to sea with the rest of the city's filth. After such time, we will systematically seek out your friends and loved ones and destroy their lives. Wouldn't you like to see a sign like that? I'll bet a lot of smokers would think twice about lighting up near a sign like that. You have to be direct. Thank you for not smoking is simply embarrassing. Personally, I think all of this upgraded feel-good language is a further sign of America's increasing uncertainty about itself. As we resume our look at the advance of euphemisms, we have to keep a close eye on the image makers, advertisers, marketers, public relations people. And to repeat an earlier point, it's important to remember that over time, this trend towards softer language has only gotten worse. I don't know when the whole thing started, but I do know that at some point in my life, toilet paper became bathroom tissue. I wasn't consulted on this, didn't get a postcard, didn't get an email, no one bothered to call. It just happened. One day I simply found myself using bathroom tissue. And then, just as my loafers were becoming slip-ons, my sneakers turned into running shoes, and in no time my running shoes became athletic footwear. It was about then that a trip to the department store revealed that my lazy slob uniform of sweatpants and sweatshirt were now located in a section called activewear. The world was changing. I saw second-hand clothing referred to as vintage apparel. I saw toupees advertised as hair appliances, in keeping, I would imagine, with the dental appliances that had long since replaced false teeth. Of course, if you didn't want to wear a hairpiece or a rug, there's a nice old-fashioned term, you could always look around for a good, reliable hair replacement system. Keep an eye out for systems. They're everywhere. The clerk who sold me my answering machine said I was purchasing a voice processing system. A mattress and box spring set is now called a sleep system. And the people who sell mops have not been resting. According to a commercial I saw recently, the Clorox Ready Mop is now America's favorite mopping system. And if you think you can escape these systems by going for a drive, forget it. Your car has been systematically infiltrated too. The heater and air conditioner became the climate control system. Your brakes have been replaced by a braking system, and your seat belts and airbags are now known as the impact management system. You can't beat the system. Marketers will always strive to make things sound more impressive than they really are. That's why dashboards became instrument panels. And how's this for laying it on thick? A magazine ad recently informed me that the cars depicted were equipped with leather seating surfaces. When you get right down to it, you have to admit, marketing people have a ton of balls. The upgrading continued. At home, I found myself watching animation instead of cartoons. And it turns out all those TV shows I'd seen before were really not reruns. They were encore presentations. At about that time, I noticed that soap operas had begun billing themselves as daytime dramas. Theaters felt overdue for an upgrade, too, so they became performing arts centers, or sometimes performance spaces, in keeping with the spirit of certain nightclubs, who now speak of themselves as party spaces. The really hip just call them spaces. While all this was happening in smaller locations, the big arenas decided they wanted to be known as events centers. Center is another word that's become important. Hospitals have long thought of themselves as medical centers, but now libraries have joined the chorus, calling themselves learning resources centers. And just to wrap this section up, and returning to show business for a moment, no matter what size the place where entertainment was being presented, at some point it was decided they would all just be called venues. Systems, facilities, spaces, centers, and venues. They're all words to keep an eye on in today's atmosphere of increasing self-importance. Want some more changes? Profits became earnings. Personnel became human resources. The complaint department became customer relations. People started offering feedback instead of criticism. Car sickness turned into motion discomfort. Messengers became couriers. Junk mail morphed into direct marketing. Special delivery was suddenly priority mail. And after all these years, I picked up the phone and discovered information was identifying itself as directory assistance. I don't even want to mention my dismay at the fact that every old-fashioned shady used car dealer in a plaid jacket was suddenly selling certified pre-owned vehicles. By this time, the dump had become the landfill. I guess it was inevitable. The garbage men who fill it had long since become sanitation engineers. And in some cities, garbage collection was going by the fancy and misleading name environmental services. The changes even got me where I lived. According to the Census Bureau, my apartment had become a dwelling unit. And when I asked my janitor to put a peephole in the door, I discovered later that actually the custodial engineer had installed an observation port. One day, a buck-toothed girl told me she had overbite. That was the day I traded in my glasses for prescription eyewear. Of course, some of these language upgrades are more widespread than others. Admittedly, they're not all universal. For instance, we still have motels, but some of them wanted to charge a little more, so they became motor lodges. We also still have house trailers, but if they're for sale and profits are involved, they become motor homes, mobile homes, modular homes, or manufactured housing. So apparently, what we thought all this time was a trailer park is actually a manufactured home community. I guess the lesson is we never quite know what we're dealing with. Could it be that all these years on the Jerry Springer Show, we've actually been watching manufactured home community trash? And I guess you've noticed the trip to the drugstore has changed a lot. The products have all been transformed. To start with, The medicine I used to take is now called medication. I have a hunch medication costs more than medicine. Mouthwashes are dental rinses. Deodorants have been joined on the shelf by antiperspirants, probably because sweat has become nervous wetness. A plain old bar of soap these days is being described variously as a bath bar, a cleansing bar, and a clarifying bar. Can you imagine your mother saying, "Young man, if I hear that word out of you one more time, I'm going to wash your mouth out with a clarifying bar"? Doesn't sound right, does it? The hair people have taken liberties, too. Hairspray, too ordinary. Try holding mist. Of course, if you don't want holding mist, you can always turn to shaping mousse or sculpting gel, anything to get you to pay a little more. Cough drops have grown up and turned into throat lozenges, some even calling themselves pastilles or troches. Guess what? Right, $2 more for lozenges, pastilles, and troches. I can remember in television's early days when constipation was called occasional irregularity. These days, in a kind of minor reverse euphemism trend, we're back to constipation, which parallels the recent TV comeback made by diarrhea. No more lower gastric distress. Diarrhea. Gotta go, gotta go, gotta go, gotta go. The new TV candor, even though you still can't say shit. And by the way, doctors used to claim that constipation could be relieved by eating more roughage. Now they're pushing fiber. I still prefer roughage. If I want fiber, I eat a basket. And hey, lady, advancing age causing vaginal friction? Tell the pharmacist you have a personal dryness problem. I'm sure he has some sort of intimate feminine lubricating solution to recommend. That's the way they describe crotch products now. Even a good old-fashioned douche has turned into a feminine wash. And remember feminine hygiene sprays? Personally, they didn't sound very tasty to me. If they had come in flavors, they might have been more successful. Vaginilla, crotchocolate, labia lime. Just a thought. Anyway, the latest female product I've heard of is protective underwear, which frankly, folks, I don't even want to think about. Euphemisms and politically correct speech have also infiltrated the food and restaurant businesses. We may as well begin with the inflated job titles, since they seem to be showing up everywhere we visit. In a truly absurd departure from reality, at some point, waiters temporarily became wait persons, as if waiters and waitresses were somehow sexist terms. For a while there, a few of them even became known as waitrons, until everyone involved simply refused to call them that. Now they seem to have settled on servers. These servers are said to be on the wait staff. Wait staff seems forced, doesn't it? And it goes without saying, no restaurant today would dare allow a cook to cook the food. Instead, the cuisine must be prepared by a chef. An important factor to keep in mind with all of this restaurant and food talk is yuppie pretentiousness. I was in a yuppie joint last year where the cover of the noontime menu, instead of saying menu, actually had the words lunch solutions. There I sat, unaware that I even had problems, and those nice folks were ready to provide solutions. Once again, I feel the need to emphasize that I actually saw this. Every example I offer you on these euphemism topics has been personally observed. And before we get to the food itself, I just want to remind you that you can usually determine a restaurant's price range by noticing how it advertises. If it uses the word cuisine, it'll be expensive. If it mentions food, the prices will be moderate. However, if the word eats is employed, rest assured that any savings you make on the food will be more than offset by high medical expenses. Now, on the subject of food itself, I'm sure you know that certain foods have been altered. And I don't mean genetically, I mean euphemistically. They tried to do it to prunes. The California Prune Board wanted to change the word prunes to dried plums, because research told them that women in their 30s reacted more favorably to the phrase dried plums. California women in their 30s. Does that tell you enough? And the poor prunes were not alone. A long time ago, the same thing happened to garbanzo beans. Apparently, someone thought the word garbanzos sounded too much like a circus act, so they began using the older name, chickpeas. Also at about that time, again for marketing purposes, Chinese gooseberries became kiwi fruit. And since it was obvious feminists would never use an oil derived from rapeseed, we were all introduced to canola oil. And just to round out our meal, the reason Chilean sea bass became so trendy a few years ago was because it was no longer being called Patagonian toothfish. That item needs no comment. And let's not even mention capellini, which became angel hair pasta. Jesus, angel hair. And by the way, who was it that took the perfectly nice word macaroni and started calling it pasta in the first place? That sounds like more of that marketing bullshit. Never underestimate the relentlessness of the marketing people. Because long before we had yuppies, consumer goods had been getting image upgrades from the marketers. For example, seltzer water has variously been known as seltzer, carbonated water, club soda, and finally, enter the yuppies, sparkling water. Sometimes these days the label on the sparkling water says lightly carbonated. Of course, that means they had to find a name for water that wasn't carbonated, and since non-carbonated sounded far too ordinary, the trendier restaurants decided on flat water. There are even a few places that refer to it as still water. It's subtle, but it's clearly a decision that when it comes to beverages, flat may possibly be seen as negative. Never overlook pretentiousness. Pretentiousness is the reason we don't drink water anymore. Instead, we hydrate ourselves. Hey, I'll hydrate myself to that. Earlier in the book, in the first section on this subject of euphemistic language, I mentioned several reasons we seem to employ so much of it. The need to avoid unpleasant realities, the need to make things sound more important than they really are, marketing demands, pretentiousness, boosting employee self-esteem, and in some cases just plain old political correctness. But no matter their purpose, the one thing euphemisms all have in common is that they soften the language. They portray reality as less vivid. And I've noticed Americans have a problem with reality. They prefer to avoid the truth and not look it in the eye. I think it's one of the consequences of being fat and prosperous and too comfortable. So naturally, as time has passed and we've grown fatter and more prosperous, the problem has gotten worse. Here's a good example. There's a condition in combat. Most people know it by now. It occurs when a soldier's nervous system has reached the breaking point. In World War I, it was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language. 2 syllables. Shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. Shell shock. That was 1917. A generation passed. Then, during the Second World War, the very same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now, takes a little longer to say, stretches it out. The words don't seem to hurt as much, and fatigue is a softer word than shock. Shell shock. Battle fatigue. The condition was being euphemized. More time passed and we got to Korea in 1950. By that time, Madison Avenue had learned well how to manipulate the language. And the same condition became operational exhaustion. It had been stretched out to 8 syllables. Took longer to say, so the impact was reduced, and the humanity was completely squeezed out of the term. It was now absolutely sterile. Operational exhaustion. Sounded like something that might happen to your car. And then, finally, we got to Vietnam. And given the dishonesty surrounding that war, I guess it's not surprising that at the time, the very same condition was renamed post-traumatic stress disorder. It was still 8 syllables, but a hyphen had been added. And at last, the pain had been completely buried under psychojargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'd be willing to bet anything that if we'd still been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have received the attention they needed at the time they needed it. But it didn't happen, and I'm convinced one of the reasons was that softer language we now prefer. The new language, the language that takes the life out of life. You don't hear the word millennium much anymore, do you? It's kind of sad. Here's a word that lies around for long periods of time looking for work, but never really doing very much. Then every 1,000 years, things suddenly pick up, and there's a flurry of activity. The word is on everyone's lips, and it's heard in almost every conversation. It stays red hot for several years, enjoying its popularity, seeing its name in newspapers and magazines, making appearances on radio and TV. But then a peak is reached, And after a while, things begin to slow down. The activity tapers off, and before long, it's once again relegated to history books, academic journals, and reference works. Goodbye, poor millennium. I'm going to miss you. When you return, I may not be here to welcome you back. I saw 2 bumper stickers on a car. Hate is not a family value, and value all families. What is the purpose of having things like this on your car? Certainly it's not to change someone else's opinion of family life at a red light. More likely, the purpose is to inform us that the driver doesn't hate anyone, and that he considers himself pure and virtuous and better than the rest of us. So it's actually self-righteousness. The driver apparently forgot that the 7 deadly sins include both anger and pride. More euphemisms. American companies now put a great deal of effort into boosting their employees' self-esteem by handing out inflated job titles. Most likely they think it also helps compensate for the longer hours, unpaid overtime, and stagnant wages that have become standard. It doesn't. However, such titles do allow an ordinary store clerk to tell some girl he's picking up at a bar that he's a product specialist or a retail consultant. If it turns out she's a store clerk too, but her store uses different euphemisms, then she may be able to inform him that she's a sales counselor or a customer service associate. And for a while there, they're under the impression that they actually have different jobs. These are real job titles, currently in use to describe employees whose work essentially consists of telling customers, "We're all out of medium." Nothing wrong with that, but it's called store clerk, not retail consultant, and not customer service associate. Apparently stores feel they can charge more for merchandise sold by a customer service associate than they can for the same junk sold by a clerk. By the way, if a clerk should be unhappy with his title, he can always move to a different store, where he may have a chance of being called a product service representative, a sales representative, or a sales associate. And I hope you took note of that word associate. That's a hot word with companies now. I saw a fast food employee mopping the floor at an In-N-Out burger, and I swear this is true. His name tag said associate. Okay? It's the truth. Apparently, instead of money, they now give out these bogus titles. At another fast food place, Au Bon Pain, I noticed the cashier's name tag said hospitality representative. The cashier. The name tag was pinned to her uniform. The people who sell these uniforms, by the way, now refer to them as career apparel, or even worse, team wear. I had to sit down when I heard that one. Team wear. Teams are also big in business, almost as big as associates. In Los Angeles' Kookaroo restaurants, the employees' name tags say team member. At a Whole Foods supermarket, I talked to the head of the meat department about ordering a special item. I figured he was the head butcher, but his name tag identified him as the meat team leader. Throw that on your resume. I guess the people under him would have been meat team associates. I didn't stick around to ask. So it's all about employee morale. And in a lot of companies, as part of morale building, the employees are called staff. But it's all right because most customers are now called clients. With those designations, I guess the companies can pay the staff less and charge the clients more. I'm not sure when all this job title inflation began, but it's been building for a while. At some point in the past 30 years, secretaries became personal assistants or executive assistants. Many of them now consider those terms too common, so they call themselves administrative aides. Everyone wants to sound more important these days. Teachers became educators, drummers became percussionists, movie directors became filmmakers, company presidents became chief executive officers, family doctors became primary care providers, manicurists became nail technicians, magazine photographers became photojournalists, weightlifters became bodybuilders, and bounty hunters now prefer to be called recovery agents. And speaking of lifting, those retail store security people who keep an eye on shoplifters are known as loss prevention managers. I don't like euphemistic language, words that shade the truth. American English is packed with euphemism because Americans have trouble dealing with reality, and in order to shield themselves from it, they use soft language, and somehow it gets worse with every generation. Here's an example. There's a condition in combat that occurs when a soldier is completely stressed out and is on the verge of nervous collapse. In World War I, it was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language, 2 syllables, shell shock. It almost sounds like the guns themselves. That was more than 80 years ago. Then a generation passed, and in World War II, the same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Fatigue is a nicer word than shock. Shell shock. Battle fatigue. By the early 1950s, the Korean War had come along, and the very same condition was being called operational exhaustion. The phrase was up to 8 syllables now, and any last traces of humanity had been completely squeezed out of it, like something that might happen to your car. Then, barely 15 years later, we got into Vietnam, and thanks to the deceptions surrounding that war, it's no surprise that the very same condition was referred to as post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables, but we've added a hyphen, and the pain is completely buried under jargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll bet if they'd have been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have received the attention they needed. But it didn't happen, and one of the reasons is that soft language. The language that takes the life out of life. And somehow, it keeps getting worse. Here are some more examples. At some point in my life, toilet paper became bathroom tissue. Sneakers became running shoes. False teeth became dental appliances. Medicine turned into medication. Information became directory assistance. The dump became the landfill. Motels turned into motor lodges. House trailers into mobile homes. Used cars into previously owned vehicles. Room service became guest room dining. Riots became civil disorders. A strike was a job action. A zoo turned into a wildlife park. The jungle became a rainforest. The swamp became a wetlands. Glasses became prescription eyewear. Garages became parking structures. Drug addiction became substance abuse. Soap operas turned into daytime dramas. A gambling joint became a gaming resort. A prostitute became a sex worker. Theaters became performing arts centers. Wife-beating became domestic violence, and constipation became occasional irregularity. When I was a little boy, if I got sick, I went to a doctor who sent me to a hospital to be treated by other doctors. Now I go to a family practitioner who belongs to a health maintenance organization which sends me to a wellness center to be treated by health care delivery professionals. Poor people used to live in slums. Now, the economically disadvantaged occupy substandard housing in the inner cities. And a lot of them are broke. They don't have negative cash flow. They're broke because many of them were fired. In other words, management wanted to curtail redundancies in the human resources area, and so many workers are no longer viable members of the workforce. Smug, greedy, well-fed white people have invented a language to conceal their sins. It's as simple as that. The CIA doesn't kill anybody, they neutralize people, or they depopulate an area. The government doesn't lie, it engages in disinformation. The Pentagon actually measures nuclear radiation in something called sunshine units. Israeli murderers are called commandos, Arab commandos are called terrorists. The Contra killers were known as freedom fighters. Well, if crime fighters fight crime and firefighters fight fire, what do freedom fighters fight? And some of this softened language is just silly and embarrassing. On the airlines, they say they're going to pre-board passengers in need of special assistance. Cripples. Simple, honest, direct language. There's no shame attached to the word cripple. No shame. It's a word used in Bible translations. Jesus healed the cripples. It doesn't take 6 words to describe that condition. But we don't have cripples anymore. Instead, we have the physically challenged. Is that a grotesque enough evasion for you? How about differently abled? I've actually heard cripples referred to as differently abled. You can't even call them handicapped anymore. They'll say, "We're not handicapped, we're handy-capable." These poor suckers have been bullshitted by the system into believing that if you change the name of the condition, somehow you'll change the condition. Well, it doesn't work that way. I'm sure you've noticed we have no deaf people in this country, hearing impaired. And no one's blind, partially sighted, or visually impaired. And thank God we no longer have stupid children. Today's kids all have learning disabilities. Or they're minimally exceptional. How would you like to be told that about your child? Actually, it sounds faintly positive. Your son is minimally exceptional. Oh, thank God for that, I guess. Best of all, psychologists now call ugly people those with severe appearance deficits. Things are so bad that any day I expect to hear a rape victim referred to as an unwilling sperm recipient. Of course, it's been obvious for some time that there are no old people in this country anymore. They all died, and what we have now are senior citizens. How's that for a lifeless, typically American 20th century phrase? There's no pulse in a senior citizen. But that's a term I've come to accept. That's what old people are going to be called. But the phrase I will continue to resist is when they describe an old person as being 90 years young. Imagine how sad the fear of aging that is revealed in that phrase, to be unable even to use the word old, to have to use its antonym. And I understand the fear of aging is natural. It's universal, isn't it? No one wants to get old. No one wants to die, but we do. We die, and we don't like that. So we bullshit ourselves. I started bullshitting myself when I reached my 40s. I'd look in the mirror and say, well, I guess I'm getting older. Older sounds better than old, doesn't it? Sounds like it might even last a little longer. Bullshit. I'm getting old, and it's okay. But the baby boomers can't handle that. And remember, the boomers invented most of this soft language. So now they've come up with a new life phase, pre-elderly. They say they're pre-elderly. How sad. How relentlessly sad. But it's all right, folks, because thanks to our fear of death, no one has to die. They can all just pass away or expire like a magazine subscription. If it happens in the hospital, it'll be called a terminal episode. The insurance company will refer to it as negative patient care outcome. And if it's the result of malpractice, they'll say it was a therapeutic misadventure. To be honest, some of this language makes me want to vomit. Well, perhaps vomit is too strong a word. It makes me want to engage in an involuntary personal protein spill.